Welcome to the third episode of the mini-series here on the Sfarim Chatter podcast, The Reception of the Zohar, a History. I'm Nachi Weinstein. Episode 3 picks up where we left off at the 18th century and will focus extensively on Rav Yaakov Emden and his Sefer Matpachas, as well as the response in Sefer Ben Yochai of Ramesha Kunitz, as well as other responses to Matpachas and other Sfarim, mainly during the 18th century. This episode will end with the Haskalah, which is where episode 4 picks up, which will emphasize Shadal, Rabbi Yoban Mozeg, and others, so stay tuned for that on Tuesday. This episode of the series is anonymously sponsored by a friend of the podcast in honor of the podcast. To sponsor an episode on the podcast, you can email me at sfarimchatter@gmail.com or check out the link and information in the show's notes. You can also find the link in the notes to subscribe to the Sfarim Chatter WhatsApp community, where I post about new Sfarim, new books, book deals, and so on. You can also find links in the show's notes to some of the books and Sfarim discussed here on this episode. And of course, if you can please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, wherever it is that you listen, Apple, Spotify, 24/6. I appreciate that. And finally, if you have any feedback on this episode or this series, I appreciate that. You can email me, sfarimchatter@gmail.com. You can also message me on WhatsApp if you're on the WhatsApp chat, and enjoy the episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Sfarim Chatter podcast and another episode here in the ongoing series on Sfarim Chatter about the Zohar and the reception and its reception history. This episode of the miniseries, and once again going to be joined by JJ Kimche. And we will now be moving forward. We're up to in the 18th century. And the star of this episode will be Rabbi Yaakov Emden, the Yavitz, and most notably his Sefer Matpachas Sfarim, which is written in Altona in 1761. And it's been republished a couple of times. It's actually a fairly more recent edition, and they actually, I think, reissued that, but it's very hard to get. Not easy. I know JJ is looking for one. If anyone finds a copy, please let JJ know. But anyways, so this is really Rabbi Yaakov Emden's, as he calls it, Hagoyis v'chakiros al Sefer HaZohar. That's really the first part. There's actually a later part, which we mentioned in a previous episode, which is our Ha'aris, and its notes on Sefer Amunis Chachamim of Rabbi Aviad Asar Shalom Basilia of Italy. That part's been republished on the new Amunis Chachamim from Zichron Aaron, but that part we're not really getting into. That's just Vuchim and some other things. So now we're really going to focus on the part on the Zohar, and it's really, to say this is something that I read through the entire Matpachas to prepare. This is one of I really went through reading through this over the summer, and it's really a strong critique in a lot of areas. Really, really. But I'll mention the Chidah, and I'll mention different things about the Rabbi Yaakov Emden. We're going to talk about his introduction and what he introduces it, and he kind of tries to downplay it at places, and in places he's stronger than others. And JJ's already making faces at me.
Don't steal my fire, Nachi.
I'm not. I just want to tell listeners, there's a lot to talk about Rabbi Yaakov Emden, and there's a full-length defense or attack on Rabbi Yaakov Emden written by Ramesha Kunitz, and we'll get to all of that later in the Chassam Sofer's quip, and we'll get to all of that later. So, JJ, welcome back. Let's start off with Rabbi Yaakov Emden.
Excellent. Thank you, Nachi, once again. Good to be back here. So, yes, we have moved into the 18th century. Although, before moving to the 18th century, we must, of course, mention the late 17th century, which is the famous episode in Jewish history of Shabtai Tzvi. And here on the Sfarim Chatter podcast, we've done an extensive a series on Shabtai Tzvi, and therefore I don't feel really the need to go through it. And most people know of it, or at least know the bare bones of it. And of course, many people know that the great, that the major innovations, especially the heterim, the sort of the license that the Sabbateans felt to the antinomian spirit of Sabbateanism often came from Kabbalistic sources, and specifically the Zohar. So the Zohar and the Kabbalah suddenly found itself as part of yet another controversy, which is the harnessing of the Kabbalah and harnessing of the Zoharic texts in order to create a form of Judaism which ran very strongly contrary to normative halachic Judaism, and therefore, once the Sabbatean fervor had died down after the conversion of Shabtai Tzvi and to Islam and the subsequent death. So then within rabbinic circles for many, many decades, more than a century afterwards, there was a great effort towards heresy hunting, towards sniffing out any remnant or any tiny hint of Shabtaut, of Sabbateanism, and extirpating it, essentially. And of course, the great argument or the massive controversy in the mid to late 18th century on this was most famously between Rav Yaakov Emden and Rav Yonasan Eibeshitz, which of course many will know about, and that Rav Yaakov Emden who we'll speak about in a moment, he essentially declared one of the major rabbis of the entirety of Central Europe, Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz, to be actually a closeted Sabbatean, based on some of the Kameot, some of the sort of Kabbalistic little bits of writing that he had produced at various times, and other things.
Kabbalistic
amulet. That's the word I was looking for. Thank you. Yes, little bit of writing, yes. And Kabbalistic amulets that he produced. And that's, of course, a subject for a different topic entirely. But here we have finally hit upon one of the most interesting men we will come across, namely Rabbi Yaakov Emden, who is in fact my Alter Zayda. I'm direct descendant of his. My grandmother was an Emden. And he was a fascinating man in many ways. Interestingly, that actually most of his life he was not. He didn't have a communal position at all. Most of his life he was a balabas. I suppose he was just a man sitting in his own home. And he was, of course, phenomenally brilliant in and wrote his Shalat and Shuvot, and he wrote works of all different kinds. He Pirush on the Siddur and Pirush on just about everything else. And also he was a very fiery polemicist. And interestingly enough, within his own house, he had a printing press. And something that is not that well known, but I find it a fascinating fun fact about Yaakov, because what that meant was that he could quite cheaply and quickly and efficiently distribute very widely his opinions. And that's why he would write something, print it out immediately, and send it. And that's why I've sometimes referred to him as the world's first blogger, right? That he would have an idea, essentially tweet it out, and that was it. That was Yaakov Emden's position in the late 18th century.
He had his own social media channel in the 18th century. Essentially, what was going on. So yes,
exactly. What's interesting also about Rav Yaakov Emden. So he was, a part of this as effort to root out any trace of Sabbateanism, but he was also very much a Kabbalist himself. Many of his books have elements of Kabbalah woven throughout the entire thing. He wrote, in fact, a Kabbalistic dictionary called Tzitzim Ufarachim, which is also a very interesting read. And his Kabbalistic writings stretch throughout his various throughout various elements of his writings. He had very interesting opinions as well. For example, he had a very respectful dialogue with Moses Mendelssohn, who was his younger contemporary in Berlin, and just many interesting parts of Yaakov Emden's life. However, yes.
That with Mendelssohn, that was about leaving the bodies out overnight in Germany. The halakha question of how long can the bodies be left out before being buried? A few days, because the authorities decided in Germany that they wanted to make sure because someone really was dead, things like that. But interestingly, with Mendelssohn, this is not a Mendelssohn podcast. Mendelssohn had tried to get smicha for Mendelssohn Eibeshitz, who didn't give him smicha. Then he gets involved with the question later on with Rabbi Yaakov Emden much later. But anyways, that's a side point. Back to Rabbi Yaakov Emden.
Well, it's an interesting side point, but the point is that I was trying to make is that Rabbi Yaakov Emden is a man of many different streams and contradictions to him, because he was on the one hand quite anti-philosophy in many ways, and certainly anti-enlightenment, but had a respectful, but knew quite a bit of external, had interaction, engagement with external ideas, and had a very sort of cordial, and I would say even, a very respectful dialogue with Moses Mendelssohn and back and forth. So this was, as I say, a man of many contradictions, probably the best resource for it, sadly, has not been published, which is the PhD thesis of Jacob J. Schachter, Rabbi Schachter of YU. He wrote his PhD thesis at Harvard under Tversky on the, on Yaakov Emden, and in there is a full account of all this. Hopefully, I think he's publishing something soon. But anyway, that remains to be seen.
Megillah Sefer, Yaakov Emden's autobiography that he's been saying he's publishing for years and decades, and he did say on the podcast, he was on the podcast recently, and he said that it should be coming out soon. So hopefully, we very much look forward to that. The current one, the nice edition, is censored, and they've all been tampered with. So that would be nice to read Yaakov Emden's autobiography. It's quite a fascinating read. One of the things he wrote is Matpachas Farm, and Matpachas, as we mentioned, you mentioned his anti-philosophy, and it's something that will play, I'm sure, somewhat of a role in our conversation, is in the other part of Matpachas that we're not going to be discussing. He is really anti-philosophy, comments on Emunus Chacham Rav Yosef Shalom Basilia, and he says Moreh Nevuchim is not the Rambam. He says it repeatedly. It's not the Rambam. It can't be the Rambam. This work, terrible work. He doesn't like Moreh Nevuchim. It's just, he knows it's the Rambam. Does he really think it's not the Rambam? There are other places I think he alludes to the fact that it is the Rambam. So what does he mean there? And this is going to come into play when he says, Zohar, at least large parts of the Zohar, not Rashbi. There's an Amira named Rashbi. Like, I'm giving it away already. What's going on over here? Let's turn to Matpachas. But I just want to at least mention that you mentioned, all those different contradictions and the different parts of Rabbi Yaakov Emden. It's worth at least mentioning that at the outset. But now let's turn to Matpachas, this work that he writes. Ostensibly, he himself says he's involved in these Sabbatean controversies, the second ones, and he himself says that he's writing this book. The Sabbateans are hanging their hat on the Zohar, and he's got to do something about it. So I'll turn it over to you now to talk about the intro.
Nari, I can tell that you have gone through the Mitpachat very, assiduously and very excited to speak about it. And so, yes, we will. I will fill in the gaps that you left there regarding the Mitpachat. But basically, yes. So he writes his book, published in the Alton in 1761, and it's a very interesting book because it's a book of two halves. It is a book of the introduction and a book of the main body of the Mitpachat itself. Now, in the introduction is very starts off at least very pious and traditional and something you'd very much expect a rabbinic authority figure in the 18th century to write. How Kabbalah is ancient and holy and Torah min hashamayim, etc., from Moshe Rabbeinu, etc. And he has this whole very pious beginning. He says, however, we have this book, the Zohar, and he says again, tries to go back. He says, again, some parts of it are Kodesh Elyon and go all the way back to the beginning and, uses his very loquacious pen in order to praise some parts of it, the core elements of it, which he believed go all the way back. However, he then starts to say, but not everything in the Zohar is that ancient. Not everything in the Zohar is that it is quite that authentic, quite that admirable. And there are some parts of the Zohar, and he basically splits it into a few different parts. Some part of the Zohar he thinks is probably from the Amoraic period, and as Nachi says, seems to think that there was also a Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai who lived in the Amoraic period, who wrote parts of it, who was a figure in it. And then he says that some extra materials, such as the Raya Mehemna, the Tikkun Zohar, are much later, the medieval period, Bichlal. And then he says there are some parts of it which were later forgeries, including the entirety of Midrash HaNe'elam, which is a section he apparently didn't like at all. And basically these were added in by later copyists and forgers of various kinds. And this is his introduction. The introduction actually seems very pious, very certainly pro-Zohar in general and pro-Kabbalah, and has that sort of veneer of very, daring anyone to try and contravene the true, core, authentic nature of the Kabbalah. That's the introduction. And then comes the book itself. What does he do in the book? He basically goes through the version of the Zohar he has, and chapter by chapter, paragraph by paragraph, he starts slashing away with his scything critical scalpel that he had developed. It's an extraordinary work because some of his comments are incredibly biting and incredibly harsh, as it were, against large chapters of the Zohar, and he comes up with 282 paragraphs in the Zohar, an enormous amount of a book, in a book that size, where he basically says this can't be true, this is forgery, this is later, etc., etc. And we're going to go through some different categories of objection. So, firstly, he expands on the Ari Nohem in terms of the anachronisms in the Zohar. There's clearly misattributions of halachas, halachas that are quoted to one person in the Talmud, but actually quoted to another person later on in the Zohar. All sorts of mistakes that are made halachically, and also the misattribution of yichus, of who was related to whom. So there are various statements in the Zohar which run very, very contrary to what's written in the Talmud, and also Islam and other areas as well. He also expands on what the Ari Noam says regarding language, because Yaakov Emden notes not only was the book written in Aramaic, it's actually quite a later and broken Aramaic. The sort of Aramaic you'd expect from someone who's read the Gemara but not very well, or is trying to write a Masechta of Gemara but isn't proficient enough in the fine nuances of Talmudic Aramaic to make a convincing job of it, right? And that's part of the issue as well. Also, he points out very famously that there are small parts of Romance languages, later Romance languages in the Zohar, including, most famously, and most people listening to this podcast will know this is like the line that people quote, which is that at some point in the Zohar it talks about a Beit Knesset is and it quotes a pasuk, etc., and basically makes a pun on Beit Knesset as an esh noga. The Beit Knesset, the shul, is a burning fire, burning ember, and it's pointed out that the esh noga in medieval Spanish means synagogue. Es noga is in a synagogue, right? And then basically what the Zohar is doing is tying in the words of this pasuk to a phrase that only appears in medieval Spanish. And firstly, obviously something that wouldn't have happened in the 2nd century of Rosh Hashanah, but secondly, points very obviously to its true source, namely its namely the medieval Spanish. So obviously the person who put in that paragraph was living, in fact, in the time when Eshnoga would have been a pun that would have been used by various others. So those are sort of the linguistic elements. There's also the ideas. As I said before, because Rav Yaakov Emden obviously had all of Jewish philosophy, all of the previous major works at his fingertips. So he also pointed out various bits, the Kuzari and Shmuel Hanagid and other elements. He also pointed out that the Zohar relies on elements of medieval science and medieval philosophy and things that appeared only in medieval medicinal textbooks of various sorts that we have that make its way into the Zohar that the Talmud had never heard of and the earlier generations had never heard of. And this is a very recognizably 11th, 12th, 13th century type of language regarding science, regarding medicine. That is, that's another symbol. There's another sort of symptom of its late vintage. Also, that Rav Yaakov Emden points out, this is very important because this will become more important later, that the Zohar mentions the names of the nekudot and the ta'amim, right? The nekudot, ta'amim meaning the vowels, the nekudas, and the ta'amim, the trop, the cantillation marks. And the nekudot and the ta'amim are, we're going to get a little bit in later episodes into exactly when they're written and that whole debate. But basically, Rav Yaakov Emden says it is perfectly clear that the names, Munach, Zarka, Pashta, etc., were medieval. And also the fact we call the kamatz, the patach, etc., all the names that we give to various vowels and the shapes, etc., this is all, only comes into play much later, comes, 9th, 10th, 11th century, whatever it is. And therefore, it shows that this must have been written after that, because not only does it vowelize the words, but it says the names of vowels, says the names of the trop, and makes drashot based on that. And that also is, in Rav Yaakov Emden's eyes, a symptom of its much, much later vintage. He also points out that the Zohar makes certain errors, especially when it comes to describing Eretz Yisrael, that it seems to make a series of topographical and geographical errors, names places that don't exist, or massively exaggerates the distance between various places, or sort of mischaracterizes other places. And what's interesting is that, this is how we put it nowadays, this seems to be a text written by people who'd never actually been to Eretz Yisrael, whose entire understanding of Eretz Yisrael is an Eretz Yisrael shel ma'ala, right? A sort of an Eretz Yisrael in their head that they've learnt about in books, but haven't actually traveled and seen the places themselves, and therefore would make all sorts of various errors of one sort or another. And again, if this was written by Rishon Bar Yochai and his Talmidim, well, they've been living in the Galil at the time, they've been living in Nimeron, and therefore they wouldn't have made such errors. So the very fact that Eretz Yisrael is described in various in ways that are clearly erroneous, at least to the best of our knowledge, is again another indication that the people writing it weren't living in Eretz Yisrael, though actually much later. And finally, and this is sort of my favorite and very Rav Yaakov Emden-esque, is he gets very angry at some of the drashot of the Zohar, and especially those which are very aggrandizing, especially to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Right, and there are some, there are all sorts of drashas that Rav Yaakov Emden doesn't like, but those that really stand out are those that seem to, I would say, almost deify the figure of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. The most famous one, the one that is most pithily expressed, is in Parshas Bo. There is this pasuk of Shalosh Parim Bashana Yireh Kol Zechucha Es Pnei Ha'adon. Right, the 3 times a year, all your males shall see the face of the master, Ha'adon, the master, and the Zohar says Pnei Ha'adon Zu Panav Shel Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Right, and of course, this is extraordinary, because Pnei Ha'adon in that context obviously means Hashem. Obviously means coming to the base of Mishkan, coming to the Mishkan, coming to the Beit HaBechira and seeing the face, so to speak. Pnei Ha'adon, and Rav Yaakov Emden on that pasuk, on that drasha of the Zohar, says Pnei Ha'adon Zu Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and Rav Yaakov Emden says Ze Chiruf V'Giduf Bevadai. This is total blasphemy. Okay? In other words, he would, and he has this kind of language throughout. This is what makes the Mipachat Sfarim a very interesting sefer, because for all of his mollifying language in his introduction, throughout the sefer he slashes back and forth at hundreds of paragraphs within the Mipachat Sfarim, and basically says that this is obvious forgery, this is heresy, this is disgraceful, this is nonsensical, and really goes to town in a very, very sharp and scything way against many, many aspects of the Mipachat Sfarim. And that's what makes it, firstly, a fascinating text, but also the sort of text which would later be picked up on, especially by those who started really vehemently opposing Kabbalah. And we're going to get to that probably in the next episode. But this is our regular achat, the full extent of Rav Yaakov Emden's various objections to the Zohar. So again, I'll go through them again. Again, the various anachronisms, the mistakes and misattributions of statements, the language, the incorrect Aramaic, the puns, the medieval Romance languages, the ideas from medieval philosophy and medieval science and medieval Jewish writings, the fact that it names the vocalization, the cantillations of the Torah, which was clearly of much later origin, the various mistakes it makes in describing Eretz Yisrael, describing various, geographical and flora and fauna and other such things, and of course the strange or blasphemous statements, theological statements that it makes, which seem to be utterly incompatible with anything remotely approaching a respectable rabbinic work. So, and again, it is extremely thorough and extensive. Over almost 300 paragraphs are 300 instances are brought throughout every book of the Sefer Zohar by Rav Yaakov Emden to show that they are unacceptable and clearly added in much later, and often by forgers or people who sought to otherwise undermine this text.
Yeah, and some of them. So, just to give an example, some of the critiques. I mean, you mentioned the famous ones in the Mampnei Elden. I know Sri Warrenty did a raid about that. There's obviously some defenses to that and to all these really, but. Some of them, like you mentioned, were just drushes. Like he talks about Islam Dash. He says, "She don nachash. Imas I have a don nachash. B'yomid yiravam. Dechsev ve'asa echa nasan bedon." V'chulu says, "Drush zeh kamay zar nachash. If really sir may take it out. You got to edit it out. Why?" And he says, "Kavanasi because yiravam was from Ephraim and not Shevetan. It doesn't make any sense." So that's like a typical drush one where he's going to come to say, "Oh, this doesn't make sense." You mentioned the Mampnei Elden. You mentioned this, all over geography issues. You mentioned talking about Islam. There's references to Islam. There's references to Christianity. This is something that he goes through extensively. There's drushes, he says it's halachic mistakes. He says in Ois Nun Ches, he says it talks about Shvua lechala al davar sheyesh bo mamish. Neder is chal afil al davar she'ein bo mamish. He says it's behapich. We know it's the opposite. What's going on over here? This is the wrong way. It's totally flipped around. He says, he brings times that it's not la halacha. He says in Samach Gimel, he says mashma. It sounds like sheroitz alaser gam basar achar gvina. Meat after milchigs. He says, "Those who quote him, that's against the Gemara. Gemara in Chulin is not like that. It can't be against the Gemara. What's going on over here?" So all over, he has comments like that. Some comments, there's different comments, as you were saying. Some are more drush, some are more halacha. But he has quite strong comments where he says. One just reading about me. I don't know where this is coming from. He talks about Pinchas ben Yair, where he says Pinchas Yair being the father. He says all confused. Is he father-in-law? Is he son-in-law?
The yichus, exactly, as I mentioned.
He goes, the yichus is all messed up. He brings another one where he says, he says, "Bilti meduyik she'in k'peidel b'kain galim yom kippur b'lvad." What's going on? Like, these are all over. It's just small critiques. If you just get a flavor of it, it's worth reading. Anyone interested? Where he says, some of the time he's just trying to make edits. He's basically trying to edit. Other time he says, "Here's the kuzari, here it's this." So it's really. He mentions something else. He says, "Begin to think of Kol Nidre." He says, "Who takana is the Goinim Achronim Bilti Mufakim?" Says the Goinim. We're talking about Kol Nidre. This is much later Kol Nidre. So again, there's a lot of, there's a lot of different things. He also one other thing, he also brings some very cute quips sometimes, as his derech is, where he brings in Kofai and Gimel, he quotes Zohar, and he says, "Havayis dabai v'rova kachazina hacha." See, Havayis dabai v'rova is Gemara. This is a Gemara, and he goes on, and he says, "This is Gemara Pesachim. What's going on here?" The Zohar is quoting a Gemara. He says, something else he brings. He says another steers Gemara all over about Yonis ben Exil was Matargim Ksuv, and the Gemara says he wasn't. These are things that all over. He quotes another one in Kufay says this is Lashon Bar Nevuchim. So again, just to bring some kind of example from the Sefer, as you were saying, and this is kind of where it's like his 300 or how many critiques where he goes through that he brings it on, and he says. Things about the guy says Bar Hadavar Shekainim Kadmul about Sefer Alaz. This short came before the Gainim. Then he brings in the Kudas, as you mentioned. There's just a lot of he's really systematically going through the Sefer. He went through it with his pen, just attacking, crossing out, attacking, making edits. And it's more than just slight edits, especially when you're reading how he writes. Now, of course, Rabbi Yaakov Emden was a very sharp writer. And
yes, he took no prisoners, my great-great-grandfather.
He definitely didn't. Then he talks about the Tefillin, Reish Ayin Aleph, Shamu, begin, the Lord, Bekin, Ela, Elaine, the Dror, Ba'asr, Shavin, and trade Zug in the Tefillin. Harry Gami, Zarai, Nitzchis, Alchibet, Kunis, Evazay, Muchim, Memachar. It's like two Tefillin. Two Tefillin is Rashi and Tam. What are we talking about two Tefillin? How can we talk about two Tefillin?
Very obviously medieval, yes.
He gets very upset. So then he ends up with what you said. He says, so he goes on, and he says, he talks about, then he kind of speaks out of both sides of his mouth in some ways. He says, he says a lot of it's kol hashar kodesh kadoshim bli safek. Yeh mechabri mishahu.
So let me get that for a second. Let me get that.
So I want you to get there. But the point is, so he says it's Kaddish, but then there's Rashbi the Achor, and you mentioned this already, with the Amoira, with the Son of Allah, the same exact facts. So talk a little bit about the end.
Well, I mean, no. What I wanted to get to is as follows: that why is this book so fascinating? Firstly, because Rav Yaakov Emden is not Yehuda Ari of Modena. He's not someone you can sort of brush aside as a peripheral figure. Rav Yaakov Emden is central to rabbinic writing and life in the 18th century. He is massively dependent upon to this day. Quoting the Shud Yavitz and other. I mean, it's just he's someone you cannot ignore, someone you cannot brush under the rug, and to have such a central canonical figure writing so sharply and so cuttingly against very large parts of the Zohar is something, it lends the stamp of credence and approval to this whole intellectual tradition that we're talking about here, namely that of Zohar criticism. Once you have Yaakov Emden on board, it's very difficult to dismiss it out of hand. That's the first thing. The second thing is, the nature of this book makes it a tantalizing read. What do I mean? I mean that there is this difference, as I mentioned, between the introduction, which seems, and the ending, Sefer Zohar, Kula Kodesh, etc., Pimo Sharabenu, fine. But the content in the middle is it's very thorough, very scything, and very dismissive and disparaging of the Zohar. So then, essentially, two readings, or two possible opposing readings of this book emerge. One of them is the conservative traditional reading, which is basically that this book was written, but he didn't fully mean it, and that basically it was only written L'Tzorach Shah, that was written because of the Sabbatean controversy, and that he basically wanted to sweep the rug from under the feet of those who try and use the Zohar in an incorrect fashion, and therefore, he wrote it in that, for those very specific circumstances, those very specific purposes. But truly, his opinion, matched much more what he was writing in his introduction about how holy the book is. And there's a comment of the Chidah that Nachi very much wants to read out that he has there. And I'm going to indulge you. Go ahead.
Yeah, and it's worth reading because, again, the whole point of this podcast, in this series, is for historical purposes and to relay something that maybe isn't so well known to a lot of the listeners, and to say both sides and to explain what's happening. So we have on the one hand Mitpachas, and Mitpachas is complicated, as you said, JJ, and you were talking about and anyone that reads it will be familiar with this. And then there's the other part, as I mentioned, where he says Moreh Nevuchim is not Rambam, but he knows it's the Rambam. So what's he writing? So over here, the Chidah this is in Marechas Sfarim in Shem Agdolim, Marechas Zayin Ois Ches, which says Zohar. And by the way, there's an interesting, fascinating story he brings about the Zohar, that it came from somewhere. The king, they dug it up in a grave. Is a whole story. That's worth mentioning as well, perhaps. But for the purposes right now, he says Ata. He says right now, Mekarav Bo Liodi Matpachas from. I got recently the Sefer Matpachas. Reisi behavora ba'almosh asa plilois. Acha kosav till he says she'ena latana. It's not a tana the Zohar el achron. It's an achron who pickback ala gdoilis v'neirois asher bezohar. And he really takes issue with the Zohar. I really had a problem with the Zohar, with the Matpachas. Rabbi Seinu Urvin der Reisa Maram Cordivero, the Ramak, Varizatzal, Bali Ruach HaKodesh, the ones are Ruach HaKodesh, Asher Nigla, Aleim Elio Zarchalatov, Bachala Aretz Yatza, Kavom, Bukse Sevel Mileim, Him Negdu Vachrem, Kama Kadosh El Yain, and everybody, they all believe in the Zohar. I mean, this is something that we mentioned, I can't be ignored, of course, that they all said this is Zohar, and the Zohar is Hashem Eichai, etc. So, of course, that's on, one side. So the Chidah is saying, what's going on over here? Therefore, I think, Gam Haravzal, Yoda be'emes ubesamim inyan Zohar Kodesh. Of course, Rabbi Yaakov Emden knew the Zohar. However, bekinosai al katu harura she'oivrim al krisis ham umises bezdin. Talking about Shabsei Tzvi, the Sabbatians, the talu atzma v'lashenes Zohar b'divrei shavashaka. They blame themselves. They hung their hat on the Zohar. Lochein hiraponim lekakea bitzosam v'loymar mishum eis lasois bepukim elu v'kavanas l'shamayim v'Hashem beracham avidinenu lekav schus. And he says, therefore, that's why he did this. That's why Rabbi Yaakov Emden went and wrote this sefer. He didn't really mean it. Now, the thing is, and I want to contrast that, though, with some quotes of Rabbi Yaakov Emden, where Rabbi Yaakov Emden writes, just to read one quote in Perek Shishi, where he's writing, he says, talk about the Tikkun Zohar and the Raya Menhemna.
Which he sees as fully later, fully flawed.
And I want to read this to contrast to what the Chida says. He says, there is no question in the world. It has to be later. There's no question. And he says, later on he quotes, he goes, I'm skipping ahead, he says, he says, you can't believe certain things, what it's saying. He says, and he goes to Remes Shal Hevel, etc., etc. And he ends up, and he says, and then he really goes after Moshe DeLeon, who he says, in Avila, and he says he made it up. And it said, and he really goes on. And he says, and then he continues, it's a forgery, it's a complete scam. It's all mixed up, etc., etc. And then he says, what's the big deal? Marshal B'tshuva, quotes the famous Marshal. The Ramah, I think we forgot to mention this Marshal. The Ramah attacks him. He says, and the Marshal says that the Marshal was an Ani, and Ashir is a whole. So the Rabbi Yaakov says, he says, Ani Hayab Shah, Amarti Ani. Ashiras Hamam and Gdulashishal Ramah Garmalais. It has the Ramah was a Ramah Mifana was rich, and that's why he said this about the Ramah, about the Marshal. I'm sorry, that the Marshal was rich, etc. So this really, first of all, if you're not familiar with the Rakham, you're getting a feel of his classic, really strong writing here all over. Yes. But he's really, really, really stark in what he's saying over here, and he's going on and on and on. It's really, he keeps piling on. So definitely parts of, he's very clear that the Medrash Nelam, he says, was forged, and he says that the Tikkun and Raya ben Hemana is Ramesh Tilion. He says that's later on. But even the earlier parts, he says it's Kaddish V'Tor, and obviously it's Kaddish, when he ends up coming out with this theory, hypothesis that there's another Rav Shimon Yochai, another Rabbi Elazar's son, and it's not the Tana. And that's really, okay. That's really what we have. Yeah, back to you. This is really what's going on in Mitbach.
So all of this was to show one side, right? This is the side of the Chida, who want to keep Rav Yaakov Emden, but distance themselves from from a large part of Mitbach Sfarim, certainly the middle parts. And therefore, they end up saying something like, "Listen, Rav Yaakov Emden obviously was on our side, the side of the those who buy fully into the antiquity and the authority of the Zohar, but." And he really knew the truth. However, he was writing because of his specific circumstances and to try and counter the Sabbateans, etc., etc. Fine, that's the one side. The other reading, of course, of Mipachat Sarim is that, listen, if you say about the Zohar, about any book, that literally hundreds of paragraphs are later and forged, then the obvious conclusion is that the entire thing is later and forged. In other words, that if I came to you, Nachi, today and said, listen, I've discovered a whole book written by the Rambam, right? I've discovered a new manuscript, 100 pages written by the Rambam, a whole thing. And then you go through it and you find dozens and dozens of examples where it's clearly not written by the Rambam, but centuries later. So then the obvious conclusion isn't that the Rambam wrote a core of it and that later generations added elements to it, but rather, no, the obvious conclusion is the entire thing is later. In other words, you can't claim the initial document is some sort of core, pristine, going back centuries, going back millennia, etc., and that literally hundreds of paragraphs within the book are much later and are bad and are fraudulent and are contradictory and nonsensical and blasphemous, etc. Right? And therefore, many figures later on in the Enlightenment, in the Haskalah, especially those who opposed Kabbalah, opposed the Zohar, as we'll see in the future episodes, they actually relied upon the Mitbachat Sfarim and actually saw the Mitbachat Sfarim as firmly on their side, as fully and totally critical of the Zohar and the antiquity of the Zohar. But obviously, Yaakov Emden, living in the time that he did and occupying the position that he did, couldn't fully undermine the Zohar, couldn't say the whole thing is nonsense. So what he did is he applied his critical skills. He applied to sort of almost modern, almost maskilic, almost almost academic tools of philology and historical analysis, etc., in the service of disproving the Zohar. But he wrote this kind of veneer, this pious introduction to try and get him out of trouble. But really, he's on the side of those who deny entirely the antiquity of the Zohar. And that is what makes the Mitbachat so interesting. So you can have these two readings, one which will say that the real Rav Yaakov Emden is a Kabbalist who sees everything is true and holy, except he wrote it for this specific reason. And you could, at the other side, say, no, Rav Yaakov Emden really is this kind of proto-modern figure, this almost maskilic figure, this person who has this extraordinary capacity for critical thinking and for rooting out essentially rooting out nonsense, rooting out later forgeries. But he, of course, had to play the game of his day and present himself still as this unimpeachable rabbinic figure of his time. That's what makes the Mipachat Sfarim so unbelievably interesting, both to read and also to consider the possibilities. For those who want to chase this up a little bit more, there's some other writing on the topic. So, for instance, in Shmuel Feiner, you've had on this podcast. So early in his book on the Jewish Enlightenment, he brings up the possibility of Yaakov Emden as a kind of proto-masculine figure. Also, Tamara Morsel-Eisenberg published an article about Rav Yaakov Emden in the Harvard Theological Review a year or two ago, and that also helps on this. So anyway, so that is Aregel Achat, the Rav Yaakov Emden's Mipachat Sfarim. Now, there are a few figures later on in the 18th and early 19th century who agreed, who seemed to endorse the positions of Yaakov Emden. These are heavyweight figures. These sources have been collated and presented in Mark Shapiro's article that I mentioned before in Miln Chavivin, called in Hebrew something like Ha'im Yesh Chiyuv Lahamin B'Sefer HaZohar, something like that. I can't remember the exact title, but he basically collects statements by various figures after the writing of the Mipachat Sfarim, which seem to endorse them. So the first and most important is the Chasam Sofer, right? Moshe Sofer, the Chasam Sofer, who was one of the great rabbinic figures in Europe and really in the whole Jewish world in those late 18th century years, and he in one of his shutim, in one of his tshuvot in Chelek Vav Siman Nun Tes, he has the following one line, and again it's a very brief line, but the line goes as follows: Hinei nimtza b'shchunatecha. You'll find Sefer Mitpachat Sfarim. He's talking about a different topic, but he just adds in this line. Hinei nimtza b'shchunatecha Sefer Mitpachat Sfarim l'Moreno Rav Yaivetz timtza sham davar gadol. Diber Hanavi. Now this Navi, he calls him this prophet, said a davar gadol. He said a great thing there. Be'inyan zeh, in this particular on this particular topic. Halo yishto mamu ro'av v'dai lemevinim. Right, and that is about as close to a written endorsement of that position as you're going to get from someone like the Chasam Sofer. But basically, what he writes there is again a very brief but quite considerable endorsement, seemingly, of what Yaakov Emden wrote. Said that you'll see there in Mipachat Sfarim what's written there, and V'dai lemevinim, which I hope for your audience I won't have to translate. And he's also quoted later on, interestingly, as saying, as sort of endorsing this point of Yaakov Emden and saying that if we took out all of the pieces of the Zohar, if we took out of the Zohar all that which was written after Rishon Bar Yochai, after in the Gaonic and Rishonic period, if we took all of that out, we'd have a very, very small book indeed. That is a line quoted in the name of Yaakov Emden the name of the Chasam Sofer by one of his Talmidim, again showing that at least one important heavyweight rabbinic figure seems to have had endorsed it. Again, lending credence to the possibility that within the rabbinic tradition, you have the Zohar criticism as a live and legitimate possibility. Another great rabbinic figure of that century who seems to endorse it is the Noda B'Yehuda, the famous Rabbi Yechezkel Landa of Prague, who also believed, who also saw great value in the words of Yaakov Emden in the undermining of this pristineness of the Sefer Zohar, and he puts it in a drasha. Now, this drasha was censored from the original publication, but it was eventually published by the original publication by Maoz Kahana, and a new edition put most of it back. But I'm going to read to you a couple of the lines there. Which goes as follows, and just to give the readers or the listeners a sense of what's written there. V'hinei ze lo yachishu kol baalei hazohar baalei kitvei ha'ari she'ein hazohar mekubal b'yad ha'uma Yisraelit dor achar dor ish mipi ish kamo shemekubal b'yadenu hamishna v'atalmud bavli Yerushalmi Sifra Sifri Tosefta Mechilta mipi hatanaim v'amoraim dor achar dor ad chachmei hamishna v'talmud be'etzem v'heim Mipi Knesset Gdola, Mipi Hanavim, Ish Mipi Ish, Ad Moshe, Mipi Agvura, etc., etc. Otherwise, nobody can deny the Zohar doesn't have this, this vaunted pedigree of having been for millennia among the Jewish people and having been, recognized as a great and central work, etc., etc. And then he sort of continues in this vein. Whatever. It's long. I'm not going to go into it. But basically, he has this fairly lengthy quote. Stating, seemingly endorsing the position that there were various shibushim, there were various, how does one say, errors or things that got broken in transmission, right? If you're trying to claim a pristine transmission of the Kabbalah, of the received tradition, well, according to the drasha by the Noda B'Yehuda that was censored but has recently been recovered and republished, that within the Zohar you can quite clearly see that there's actually a lot of things that don't belong there, that shouldn't be there, and the things that crept in, and shibushim, things that are errors or incorrect, essentially, of course, doesn't disqualify the entirety of Kabbalah, doesn't fatally undermine everything, doesn't say the whole of the Zohar is fraudulent, but he seems to endorse this kind of Rav Yaakov Emden-esque approach, which undermines the Sefer Zohar. And finally, the third of the rabbinic opinions at the time is one of the pupils of the Noda B'Yehuda, Rav Elazar Fleckeles, who wrote a tshuva in which, again, he says that he was talking about Hilchos Shavua, what can you swear by, what can't you swear by, and he basically says you are not allowed to swear by, to make an oath by the Zohar. Why? Because large parts are obviously forged, and it's and in fact he brings up, he says that you have it's important to say so in defense of Rashbi, and this is actually something that's quite interesting, quite common to those who criticize the Zohar, who say, we must criticize the Zohar, right? Because Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is such an important figure, and he's such a holy figure and such a central figure, and therefore to say that he is the author of this book with all these anachronisms and all these mistakes and all these incorrect halachot and all these incorrect yichusim and everything. So therefore, in defense of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, we actually have to come out and say, no, this isn't written by him. This is obviously written much later, and that. So basically, the point I'm trying to make is before we get to the critics of Rav Yaakov Emden, it's important to note that in the decades immediately following the publication of Pachat Sfarim, you have very significant heavyweights, such as the Chasam Sofer, such as the Noda B'Yehuda, such as Rav Elazar Fleckeles, who come out and either implicitly or absolutely explicitly endorse his view that within the Sefer Zohar you have quite a considerable amount of later interpolations, forgeries, elements that shouldn't be there, and therefore it cannot be considered pristine, cannot be considered perfect like is imagined by many.
So a couple of things to mention there. The Noda B'Yehuda, so that drasha is now the new drasha Noda B'Yehuda, the new beautiful 2-volume drasha. It's almost all there. The little piece, I think, with the Zohar, I think they're removed, and they note that they do. But the edition, you can find the Mouse Kahana's.
Yeah, Mark Shapiro mentions that too. Yeah,
but they didn't mention it. So that you can find, and you can see the drasha of the Noda B'Yehuda. There's a similar type of drasha, not exactly that Shlomo Elazar Fleckeles himself, but Olis Chedesh Sheni, where he talks about the Kavanas on Rosh Hashanah. And then you mentioned the Chasam Sofer. What's interesting about the Chasam Sofer and the Noda B'Yehuda, both the Chasam Sofer himself was quoting Zohars and all Kabbalah, throughout his Sfarim, and the Noda B'Yehuda, who doesn't so much. It comes up also with the Shem Yichud thing. The whole Shem Yichud, the Noda B'Yehuda, being against the Shem Yichud, is that the Noda B'Yehuda. Professor Sharon Flato has written a book about the Kabbalah of the Noda B'Yehuda, that the Noda B'Yehuda, we know, learned Kabbalah. He was in the Klois and Brody for a long time, and the Klois and Brody, they learned Kabbalah. That's what they did. They were big with Kabbalah, so he definitely knew Kabbalah. And again, Prague was a hotbed of Frankist activity. That's Sabbatian related. So this is, as well, people now know Frank in the news, Candace Owens or whatever. So the whole, right?
I can't believe she made it into this podcast. Gosh, we've fallen.
The whole terrible. So therefore, that was real Frankist hotbed in Prague. So, and Rav Elazar Fleckeles, we'll get to in a second, wrote a whole sefer Avos David against the Franks, attacking the Franks. So there is some of this. You can bring back up this chida again as it relates to here. Now, the Rav Elazar Fleckeles is worth to know. It's in Shuv Me'ava Chelik Aleph Simon Chavav, and it's really very strong language. You didn't read this one inside. I think it's worth to read it to the listeners. What he says, and he continues.
If you'd like to read it, go ahead.
I'm going to read some of it.
I'm operating on the assumption that the listeners believe me in what I'm saying, but if you want to elaborate, then I hear the value of it.
I think they do, and I don't want to read too many texts. And I know we've read a bunch on this podcast episode, and sometimes I think that's a mistake on a podcast. But I think here it's worth reading to hear the text inside, especially about such a topic that we're discussing. So what he says is, "This person says kula kaddish." I say, Rav Elazar Fleckeles, Hari nishba. He's swearing. Harani nishba b'teiras Hashem. Shepe Sefer HaZoyer nimtzu. It's found kama ziyufim, many forgeries, v'kolkulim and errors. Asher esifu v'ola achas mitalmud bavli havayis dabai v'rova kodesh esim kol Sefer HaZoyer. The whole Gemara is more kodesh than a Sefer HaZoyer. Ki emes hadavar she'achibar hazeh hu me'atan Rav Shimon Bar Yochai asher Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi kibul gam mimenu. If it's true that this is Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi kibul gam mimenu k'mavur b'akdamas HaRambam l'Sefer Yad HaChazaka that the Rambam wrote in the beginning of Yad HaChazaka. How's it possible? Lo Zohar Sefer HaZeh. The question that we've mentioned a million times. How does it has not mentioned anywhere? For Rabbi Yochanan shechibur Talmud Yerushalmis, ain't maskir b'shem makar. Rabbi Yochanan doesn't mention anywhere. For Ravina Rav Ashi shechibur Talmud Bavli meya shanim achar chibur Talmud Yerushalmi 100 years after. For Yosef Amoraim, there end of Amoraim v'loy shamu remez b'chol Talmud Misefer HaZoyer Rabbi Bar Nachmuni Rechmeni shechubar right Medrash Rav v'sheichatoy v'kitzim harbi lo yizarchu mechibur Rashbi. We don't see anywhere about this Sefer Moshe Mechai. Gam Rabbanan Saveroi, Vagoinim, Varif, Varambam, Virashi, Vitaisis, Viramban, Virashba, Virash, Vitor, Vialkashemaini, Asher Osaf, the Alkashemaini, Asher Osaf, Elikit, Kolam Madrachas, Vanachiltos Abrises, they collected from everything. Kulam, all them, Layodu, they didn't know, Voliromi, man, they didn't see anything of the Davar Ad, Shazeh Kariv, Lashalish Mea Shanim, 300 years ago, Anu v'Amru, Shamatzuu, they said they found it. V'izu, Knisia, Asher Kiblu, Bechanafeh, Kamatam, Rav Yerushalmi, Ve'ein, he says. Now, as it continues, Ve'enani chalila is what you were saying, JJ. Ve'enani chalila, God forbid, Matal doifu pagam b'kavaratano eleki Rav Shimon Bar Yochai.
Right.
By the way, everyone says a ton of Chavatana Elikai. It should be Eliki. There's a side point, but like whatever. I think so. He's from the Chasidi Elyon. Avalani Oimer Lav Gushpanka the Rashbi Vizgasi Chasmulet doesn't have the stamp of Rashbi on the Zohar. Umishi Yesh Lechatzidas. Anyone that's half a brain. Yagid K. Shari Niskru b'Sefer HaZoyer Kamatanoim v'Ameroim she'acher Rashbi Shanim Rabbis b'Misper v'Arachti b'Zeh b'Mokem Acher Mipisipurim B'Seifrim K'Mevur B'Sefer Matpachas Lagoyim Marino Rav Yavid Zatzla Shegozar Oimer the Hishtet Shecholu Boy Yodim Esayofim v'Chosher Esachacham Ramesha Dilyon Yayin Sham. Look there. So he really is extensively piling on. And another part of Shuv Me'ava, he says Kvar Kazafti Palmim Rabbi in Raya Me'azoyer Shlina Debar Mio Ma'asim Malak Sefer HaZoyer v'Harbi Yasif. I don't know where it's from. So this is a big deal. By the way, just aside to mention here, Shuv Me'ava Chelik Daled, which just sold at auction. Now they're redoing all the volumes. Machonat Serachav will be very nice. Curious to see what they'll do here with this comment here. But this is very strong. I mean, these are very strong comments that were made by Aman. Now we get to the point where there's a defense. So yes. I mentioned the edition. I will mention that two other things worth mentioning. First of all, Rabbi Yaakov Emden was published a beautiful edition, Emes Liyaakov, with Tzitzim U'Prachim, as you mentioned, but also these are his Hagoys, we have his Zohar, these were his marginal notes on the Zohar, and he references them at times. So that's been published by, it was actually published by somebody in Monroe. He published it, a really nice job. He actually also has Hagoys to Marinayim of DeRossi, and there's some other things, a really nice volume. You can get a hold of that, and you can read his notes, Rabbi Yaakov Emden. But, what's also worth mentioning is, so we're going to get to the defenses. So I'm sorry, before that, there was an edition of Matpachas put out with the Hagoys of that edition was published in Lemberg, in Lemberg, and it had Itter Sfarim, Reuven Kohen Rappaport of Tarnopol, who I believe to some extent was related to Shir. I forgot to look up exactly how Shlomi Yehuda Rappaport, who will mention shortly how he comes into the story. The Excited son-in-law, the Rabbi of Prague, a Maskil, noted Maskil. But the point that's important here, Ramesha Kunitz, the Rabbi of Oban in Hungary, and he comes in and he says he writes an entire book, Ben Yechai. Anyone seen the original? Tall Sefer, and it's got a nice picture of the cave that Rashbi stayed in the cover, and not the cover, on the Sharblat. And so he writes this defense. Now, what's interesting about Kunitz is Kunitz was an interesting figure, and in his Tshuva, Sefer Masarif, I believe it's called, he ends up this gets into Reform and Chorin for those that are familiar with that whole parasha. And so the Chassam Sofer and others do not like Ramesha Kunitz, and there's a quip, I don't know where it is, that Ramesha, I don't know if the Chassam Sofer purportedly said, Ramesha Kunitz should have written Matpachas, and Rabbi Yaakov Emden should have written Ben Yechai. Now, it doesn't really jive well with Rabbi Yaakov. So the other quote we said, the Chassam Sofer written inside, where he says, look at Rabbi Yaakov Emden said it's great. So, okay, whatever, just putting that aside. But the point is, Ramesha Kunitz, he, though, is the one that writes this massive defense. It's a big book, a defense called Ben Yechai of Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, and I'll just already mention it before you start that. Basically, there's Matpachas. Then it comes afterwards. Comes Ben Yechai, Ramesha Kunitz's defense, and then Shlomi Yehuda Rappaport Shir writes an attack on Ben Yechai defending Rabbi Yaakov Emden. JJ, I'll turn it over back to you.
Yes. So once again, sorry to interrupt your rather enthusiastic monologue there. No, but it's no. So you're 100% right. So following Rav Yaakov Ender's Pachat Sfarim, there are in fact a few, as you say, defenses essentially that were written towards in the early to mid 19th century, and first of them is Moshe Kunis, as you say, an interesting man, a Hungarian rabbi, studied with Cheskel Landau and others. Also, he had this, as you mentioned, one of his tshuvot was co-opted by the early members of the Reform movement who brought out a set of Shelot and Tshuvot to try and justify some of their innovations within the synagogue life, etc. And therefore, and you know that's sort of, as you say, a subject for another deep dive. However, so he puts out this book, Ben Yochai, which is an attempt to counter some of the claims made by Rav Yaakov. Now, the truth is, a lot of the Ben Yochai is very difficult to read and to summarize because it is extremely technical. Now, there's also another thing about the difference about Rav Yaakov and Mitpachat is it's also very technical. In other words, it goes deep into the texts of many of the paragraphs that it's critiquing in the Zohar, and compares it word for word with other Mamari Chazal or in Shas or in Midrashim, etc., and then has all sorts of very, very fine attempts at critiques. However, there are I would say that Rav Moshe Kunis Ben Yochai is, following the quip of the Chazal himself, not the greatest of defense. We'll get to a better one by David Luria later on. But there are a few points. So firstly, is he leans quite heavily on the Ruach HaKodesh argument for the anachronism. In other words, pointing out that, yes, you're right, Rav Yaakov, and that there are things in the Zohar written later. And this could, and there are various possibilities why this could be, but one of them is that, I would say, they had the power to talk about things that happened in the future, and therefore, if you have Ruach HaKodesh and you're writing in this vein, then therefore you shouldn't be surprised to find things that are mentioned later on. Also, he kind of critiques Rav Yaakov Emden's critique of the Zohar's use of Aramaic, right? Because what he says is, and this is this has a certain amount of validity, which is that some other rabbinic text, most notably the Gemara, the Talmud Bavli, is also very mixed in style, right? And you'll find the Talmud Bavli, bits of earlier rabbinic Hebrew, obviously in the Mishnah, and then the early Brises, and then later rabbinic Hebrew, and then you'll find some Aramaic, and you'll find earlier opinions, you'll have later opinions, the Stama, etc., and you can kind of find differences in language, differences in tone, differences in, you can find inconsistencies, and you can also find a development within the book itself if it was written over a certain period of time, and basically says that, this characterizes rabbinic texts of this kind, and therefore you shouldn't be entirely surprised to find inconsistencies or seeming linguistic anachronisms within the Zohar, because again, this is the style. He also, this is one of the interesting things about Rav Moshe Kunis' book, is that he seems to advance the idea that that when the Zohar, there's a difference in the Zohar between when it says Reb Shimon Bar Yochai and when it says Stam Reb Shimon, right? And basically, his belief is that when it says Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, that is the genuine, ancient, correctly reported sayings of Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, and that we give enormous weight to, and halachic weight and hashkafic weight, etc. Whereas if it's Stam Reb Shimon written later on, then less so. What is interesting about that, of course, and much of what Rav Moshe Kunis writes and other later critics of Rav Yaakov Emden is that it's very difficult once Rav Yaakov Emden has written what he's written to claim again, to go back to pre-Rav Yaakov Emden, pre-Ari Nohem, and claim a sort of pristine and perfect Sefer HaZohar. And others, those who look into it, like Rav Moshe Kunis and others, they admit, yes, you can occasionally have something maybe written in the time of the Amoraim. In other words, they go some steps towards allowing for a gradually developing pieces of the Zohar, and that's interesting. And also, funnily enough, one of the most useful parts of Moshe Kunis towards the end of the Ben Yochai is where he has a very lengthy list of examples where of the interaction, let's say, between Kabbalah and Halacha, and the extent to which actually elements of Kabbalah and elements of the Zohar even entered into the halachic system, the halachic process, and therefore should be given serious weight precisely because it entered in. And that, of course, the truth is, that is one of the, I don't know about convincing, but certainly a strong argument from those who do try and defend the antiquity and the authority of the Zohar, is to say that, look, you can't argue with success. At the end of the day, it's now baked into the halachic system. It is now entered into mainstream Judaism. And in fact, it's very difficult to imagine most of the books written, certainly in the last 500 years since the revolution in Tzfat, hard to imagine any of these books without the influence of Kabbalah, without the influence of Zohar. And therefore, that is retroactively an endorsement of its antiquity and its authority. Right? It wouldn't have been the case. The Kabbalah couldn't have integrated the halakhism and also minhagim. It wouldn't have been the basis of so many minhagim if there wasn't this ring of authority and authenticity to it. So he kind of reverses the argument made, there are contradictions. Okay, maybe there were contradictions with the Bavli, but it's been accepted into the halachic system, and that proves what we need to prove. That proves that it is in fact ancient and in fact authoritative. So that is some of the more interesting points of the Sefer Zohar. However, there was a better, again, Lefi Aniyut Da'ati, my characteristically humble opinion, a criticism that was written during the 19th century. That is by Reb David Luria, who was a descendant of the Maharsha, of the Yam Shel Shlomo, and he wrote a book called Sefer Kadmut HaZohar. I don't have here when it was written exactly, but basically it is again a response to specifically to Rishon Bar Yochai, to Rav Yaakov Emden. All these names swimming in my head. Response to Rav Yaakov Emden, response to the Mitpachat Svarim, and it is, in my opinion, a more scholarly, less pedantic, and better organized. And it comes up with actually much more creative counterclaims. I'll go through a few of them. And what's interesting is that some of them have actually been agreed upon in modern academic parlance. I'll give you a couple of examples. One is that he points out that basically it is very difficult to imagine that Moshe de Leon alone authored this entire thing. And he points out that different elements of the Zohar seem to have different hands, different authorial styles, etc., etc. And he says, this collection of over 20 different texts, and which would read very differently and seem very differently. All of these are going to be written by one late 12th century Kabbalist from Moshe de Leon. We have his other books; they don't seem that impressive. The whole Zohar is written by him. And what's interesting is, and we'll get to this in a later episode, is that actually scholars, academic scholars of Kabbalah in the 21st century actually do recognize this. In fact, say that there were other hands at work. It wasn't just from Moshe de Leon, but actually the latest sort of academic theories point to many different authorial hands, many different glosses and redactors, really as part of the journey of the Sefer Zohar from a series of texts into a book. And therefore, to a certain degree, Radal, his comment there in the Kabbalah Sefer Zohar is actually very is very legitimate in that way. Another point that he makes is that there seems to be something called the Midrash Yerushalmi, which is quoted by various Gaonim. And the stuff that is quoted by the Gaonim in the name of this Midrash Yerushalmi, which we don't seem to have otherwise, seems very similar to the Zohar, right? And this brings us to a little bit of an issue, which is that he basically there is this argument over how closely the Zohar hews to the other rabbinic texts that we have. In other words, how similar is it to the Gemara? How similar is it to the Bavli, the Yerushalmi, the Midrashim, etc., etc.? And one of the things David Luria tries to do is to claim that actually, no, it's quite similar to a Midrash that seems to have been quoted by the Gaonim. And the question becomes, okay, but who's quoting whom? Right? In other words, that he seems to be saying that ancient Midrash Yerushalmi pre-Gaonim is the Zohar, whereas those who want to claim the Zohar is late will say no, that actually this Midrash Yerushalmi quoted by the Gaonim eventually made its way into the Zohar. In other words, claiming that there are strong affinities, and there are, between the Zohar and rabbinic texts, it can work for both sides. In other words, one side will claim that the Gemara and the Midrashim were first and later copied by the Zohar, and others will claim no, the Zohar was first and was later copied by the Gemara and the Midrashim, etc. So that's an interesting point. He also, funnily enough, he seems to have been a big fan of Moshe de Leon, because Moshe de Leon, we have other works of his, and he was a Makubal. He was, a scholar. I mean, he wasn't known as one of the great men of his generation, but he certainly was a scholar and was a pious man, a chassid, etc. And he says, can you imagine that Moshe de Leon would be guilty of such forgery, would be guilty of lying and saying this was attributed to Rishon Bar Yochai, which is an interesting creative defense. And this touches on the whole argument over whether the Zohar is in fact, even if it's not written by Moshe Dayan, whether in fact it's a forgery. Can we consider it forgery, or can we consider it pseudepigraphy? And this is the big argument between Heinrich Gretz and Gershom Shalom, which I will shall touch upon in the final episode. But it's very interesting that he seems to base it again on the piety and the honesty of Moshe de Leon, and okay, he couldn't possibly have made it up. Another interesting issue is that he seems to, again, very interesting. He says that the Zohar is mechadesh chidushim in halacha, right? That it has new halacha, it has new laws, and then he asks, "Hayitache? Could it be that a book written 13th century, way after the Gemara, way after anything else, could it be that it has all these chidushim? Could it be that it has all these innovations in the law? Of course, surely not." He says, surely not, this could possibly be the case. And therefore, because it's an interesting flipping of the script, because it is so new, because there are these innovations, because it does argue with the Gemara, it has different halachic traditions, so it couldn't possibly be related. It wouldn't have dared, as it were, to argue with the mainstream rabbinic texts of many centuries gone by. And to this, if I may interject my own sort of way of thinking on this, to this I call it the Donald Trump defense. Okay? Why don't we Donald Trump defense? Recently, there was an interview in which Donald Trump told over a conversation between him and Vladimir Putin, and he said that he said to Putin, "Oh, I'm going to do this and this and this," and then he says, and then Putin said, "No way," and I said, "Way," and basically that's how he related that particular conversation. Putin said, "No way," and I said, "Way," and what I mean by that is that sometimes in history you have that where someone claims, "No way." And the answer sometimes is way. In other words, the answer to hayitachin sometimes is yitachin. Such things happen. In other words, what David Luria here is trying to flip the script and say, the Zohar is mechadesh. Could it possibly happen that a later work will come up with new halachas that weren't heard of before? And the answer is sometimes yes, and sometimes that does happen, and sometimes there is innovation within the halachic realm, and that in and of itself, sometimes no way is just way. Yes, that you see it in black and white, and therefore that particular sort of counter remark isn't really worthy of it doesn't really work that well. And finally, it's very interesting, Don Lurie. I think of all the criticisms, it really is the most creative and in some way the most compelling work. He tackles the problem of it being written in Aramaic, right? And as I mentioned before, why Aramaic? Surely it doesn't make sense if it was in fact written by Rishon Bar Yochai. Surely that would only make sense if it was written in the medieval period, because it was only then that Aramaic was the language of the scholars, whereas in the time of Rishon Bar Yochai, it was only the language of the commoners, not the language of scholars was Hebrew. So firstly, he goes into the whole issur that is written within rabbinic text of the prohibition against writing down elements of the oral law, the elements of Torah Sheba'al Peh, Iyata Rashai Lekotvam, I think is the precise phrasing. And basically, he shows from various sources that only applies in Hebrew. In other words, Torah Sheba'al Peh is forbidden to be written down, but only in Lashon HaKodesh, only in Hebrew, right? And therefore, the Zohar is written so as not to contravene the whole issue of writing down Torah Sheba'al Peh. So they got around it as a sort of halachic loophole by writing it in Aramaic. He also mentions that he believes that actually it was finally written down, not by Rishon Bar Yochai, but actually a century or two later in Bavel, and therefore that makes sense to be written by the Amoraim. He also has this whole idea of Aramaic becoming sort of a royal, dignified language after Daniel, and goes in that vein for a while. But I won't go too deeply into that. But anyway, this is the counter arguments from Rav Luria, Sefer Kadmon Lazar in the early 19th century, and between Moshe Kunitz and Sefer Kadmon Zohar, this represents, I think, the two probably most well-known or most direct attempts to counter the claims of Rav Yaakov Emden in his Mipachat Sfarim against the various rabbis who I mentioned earlier who appeared to endorse it.
Yeah, so that's from David Luria, and that's the Kadmon Sefer Zohar. And again, this comes together with, it used to be a volume together. We put it together, but you can get them on Hebrew books, and I'll link to them. Kadmon Sefer Zohar, David Luria, Sefer Zohar Kir Baruch Liner, the Radziner Mugin V'Tzidim B'Tzich HaZachavar, and then the purported Sefer of the Ramchal is in there as well. And the B'Tzich HaZachavar of David Luria are both from the base medrash of the Gra as well. The Gra is someone we haven't mentioned here yet.
We're about to. We're going to get there.
Because we should mention him, and they do claim something with the Gra. So yes, okay, but I'll leave that. But,
I mean, there isn't. Go on.
As far as we know, I mean, the Goin accepts the Zohar, and he accepts.
So the issue is
as being Rishon Bar Yochai, and that plays a big role. The Goin, etc. In besides for Chassidim, we haven't mentioned either yet Chassidim. These are all accepting the Zohar as Rishon Bar Yochai. That gets to the question of today, but we're not there yet. So yes, I'll turn it back to you.
We are just about to get there. So we have just mentioned again what was going on in the mid to late 18th century in parts of Central Europe with with Rabbi Emden, Yoris and Eibeshitz, and the Nod Behuda, etc., and this is all clustered around Germany and Moravia, and which is now the Czech Republic, etc. Now, of course, towards the end of the 18th century, there were many further developments in the history of Jewish ideas. Very, very important one. Of course, the most important is the advent of Hasidut and the advent of Hitnagdut, or those who oppose the Hasidim. Now, starting with the latter first, I mean, it's, again, this is obvious to anyone who's done even a little bit of research into this, which is that Hasidut is very strongly based on earlier Kabbalistic texts, and especially the Sefer HaZohar. The Zohar becomes a primary text. It becomes a text that is frequently quoted, frequently used, frequently built upon, and treated as the basis for further investigation, further creativity in Hasidic discourses. So far as I can tell, within the Hasidic world, and again, we're talking about a world that is far removed, at least geographically, from the areas we've been talking about where there were some rumblings against the Zohar, Italy, Germany, etc. So Hasidut was, of course, developed much further into the east, in the Russian Empire, in Ukraine, and as far as I can tell, within those camps, there were not much polemics really on either side, but certainly not any evidence that I can tell of Zohar criticism. And the truth is, this is quite. This is on brand, as it were, because of course the part of the point of Hasidut is I would say almost a sort of a simple faith, a full acceptance, or maybe not a simple faith, but a faith based on instinct, on intuition, on experience, rather than on a precise philological investigation of things. I mean, that isn't really the style of Hasidic thinkers at all. And so, therefore, the Zohar becomes a very important play there as well. As basis of that, of course, some Hasidic thinkers, use the Zohar to develop much further. I'm thinking, of course, of Shneur Zalman of Liadi and Chabad and other such figures, and there's a lot to be said there. But I think there's not much need to go into that. And of course, the advent of Hasidut. You want to say something, Nachi?
Yeah, I will just mention that the Kamarna Hasidus is known as being very Kabbalistic, and so one of the Kamarna, B'Sach Yechiel Misafrin, in his Sefer Zer Chai, he says that he does talk about, we mentioned before Raya Mehemna, and he says Raya Mehemna nichta b'zman hagoyim. This is what he says in Yikri Zer Chai Bereshis Mamalev, and he says in the Simmet Pesecha, he says it also b'soifim Rabbanan Savaroi Tchilas hagoyim Ish Kodesh Echad Shei Benish Vasar Shabinu Mamish Beniskala of Kol Chavrai Rashpim Chavera V'Hu Chibur Sefer Raya Mehemna V'Gam Sider Shevet Tikuna V'Hoyz V'Kamat Dvar Me'Azar V'Gam Dvar V'Shechetchu. So he's talking about the Raya Mehemna and the Tikkun Ezra. So this is something we saw this in Rabbi Yaakov, and then so you're seeing this kind of, and we're going to get back to Rabbi Valoria shortly about the Gain, but I'll leave you, go back to you. But you're seeing this even now, the Chassidim, this is someone that has a full commentary on the Zohar. You're seeing this part of certain parts of the Zohar kind of separating them out. But anyways, that's...
Right. So this is correct in the sense that, as I was mentioning before with Rav Luria and many others, certainly after Pachat Sfarim, it became much more, I would say, acceptable to adopt some kind of middle position, right? To adopt the kind of position which accepts that, maybe not all of the Zohar is written by Rashbi. There's certain elements that were later, the Raya Mehemna, the Tikkun Zohar, the Zohar Chadash, elements of it, which were, as you say, maybe written by Amoraim, maybe written in time the Gaonim, and sort of to allow for a certain degree of Kabbalah, of Zohar skepticism, or at least a partial admission that not every word of it, not every element of it was is as ancient as might have been understood or might have been thought of by others. And of course, as you're going to get to, the second part of this equation, of course, is Hitnagdut, is anti-Hasidism. Of course, the major figure there is the Vilna Gaon. I don't think for an audience like yours, I need to go too deeply into who the Gaon was or the nature of his achievements, his accomplishments. Obviously, the Gaon, as should be known by everyone, was a very significant Kabbalist as well, set an enormous amount of store by it, actually wrote very extensive commentaries on large parts of the Zohar, and as far as we know, accepted the Zohar as entirely authoritative and also entirely ancient. In other words, truly the workings of Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. Having said that, there is, I did read, and I can't confirm this, I haven't seen this firsthand, but I did read that apparently the Vilna Gaon was very careful to try and get lots of different printed versions of the Zohar and to compare them and contrast them, because he wanted to, when he's writing his Pirushim on them, he wanted to be absolutely sure that he got the correct girsa, which at least indicates the possibility that he thought as well that in the printed editions there may have been some elements that crept in of various, which either weren't there originally or mistakes that got in over the centuries, which again is not nearly the same as critiquing the Zohar, not nearly the same as trying to undermine its antiquity, but it does allow for the possibility of a certain amount of human error that would have distorted, let's say, certain passages in the Zohar, which again is a very soft form of the critique of Yaakov, but nonetheless, it at least partially accepted. It's no longer treating this as 100% pristine, but it comes back a little bit and allows for the possibility of a certain degree of human error creeping in and resulting in the text of the Zohar that we have today.
The only thing that I can add about the Gaon, which is unique, there's an interesting comment of David Luria in his Kadma Sefer Zohar. He was from the Beis Medrash of the Gaon, and he says, he ends off, this is on page Ayin Ches, the end of Anaf Ravi. He says, I want to end off this Anaf, this part, that he says that Nichtav Zohar b'mei Tanoim umikoidem lechasim etam, it was written before the Gemara. Shekarav liyas divrei shneim chem. Could be both. This is what we were talking about in the middle passage. Ikar chibra Zohar nistar b'mei Tanoim. Originally, it was put together by the Tanoim with Talmidei Rashbi al Pirab Abu Kshmagzav Lel b'anav chamishi. Sorry, Kashkasavti lekamon b'anav chamishi mitzvah. Avol imsoib gamken. You also find my morim shnistu midrash shal Rashbi with Talmidei Talmido shemei Amarim. You find later on by the Amarim. Rak. Have a ton of Midrasha, the Rashbi, Masnisi, Didei, etc. Basically, they put both together. And he says, with Frat, specifically Medrash Hanelam, Sheroiv, Hamidabrim, Boyhem, Amaroim. You can't deny that there's Amaroim in there. That's what's going on in Medrash Hanelam. Vadai, Ikrinestor, Amaroim. It has to be what's put together, Amaroim, the Medrash Hanelam, and the other parts, he says, this kind of mixed thing. Kimedumani. And I believe, Shadash Rabbeinu Godla Grozal Hayakim. That the Goyin held like this, he says. Shenistar b'mei ha'meroim koydem chasis mistam. It was put together before. Shematzazi appears shalaram be'aleischa. He brings him ba'aleischa, and he brings a quote, etc. So you can read this on page 9. So there is some sort of quote.
But he does say this as nirali. In other words, this is his reading of it. But nowhere do the Gon say this explicitly, and absolutely indication of this. But this is his take on it.
Sure not. But there is some again, and the Goyin, as far as we know, did accept the Zohar as Rishon Bar Yochai. But it is worth pointing out that someone from the Beis Medrash of the Goyin, David Luria, even though he's definitely saying came from Rishon Bar Yochai, he is saying there's some sort of in between something or other here. He's trying to do as a defense to Matbachas, to these kind of critiques. So again, it's on page Ayin Ches and and you can read it. And again, just worth reading, worth pointing out this Ha'ara. But I think the overarching point though is that, and we'll get to today. We're not really up to today. We're not on episode 5, but you really see, starting from the earlier period, and especially going through, we mentioned Sfas, Riz of Cairo, and then Arizal, and Amashur Cordovero, etc., and then coming down to, getting down to the Goyin and Chasidim, so accepting as the Zohar as Rishon Bar Yochai. And this is kind of where we are today.
Yes, correct. And the truth is, I guess this brings us to a close within of this particular episode of the 18th century. What I would say, the last thing I would say is probably is Chaim of Volozhin, who doesn't explicitly address this, but of course builds a lot of his theology and all those ideas of Talmud Torah and Torah Lishma and what it means and why one learns and the value of full-time learning. Obviously builds it off of a kind of Kabbalistic and Zoharic worldview. And again, implicitly endorsing this as ancient and as authoritative, etc., etc. Again, although he doesn't address the topic head on, which means that he's not really so much part of the story that we're weaving here. And then next episode, we're going to go on to the 19th century, in which we have, or late 18th, early 19th century, we're going to travel further west to the Haskalah, to the to parts of the Wissenschaft, and to the great debate between the two most extraordinary Italian rabbis of the century and everything they had written. So that is very much on the cards. I'm looking forward to that.
Shadal and Bleo Ben Mosing, and that is a definitely very interesting topic. And we should already mention here that's because you have a full new translation, an annotated edition of Shadal's Vikuach coming out, or will be published at the time it's released. We'll see. But regardless, there'll be a link to that either way because it's available for pre-order if it's not out yet by the time this is posted. And you also you edited the letters between Ben Moseg and Shadal that was edited by Dan Klein. So you did that as well. That's another volume that you did with Dot Press. So we'll discuss that as well. And there's a lot to discuss as we move forward. So for that, thank you, JJ, for joining me for episode 3.
Of course. Looking forward to the next one.